I just want to start. First, as I said, there was a typo in my Twitter handle. Is Christel with a T. A lot of the posts you will see are in French because French is my first language, but I also share in English. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook if you're interested. And I just wanted to start with an observation because we're not approaching this in a void. I started discussing and approaching the topic of populism or so-called national populism back in 2016. If you remember, that was 5 years ago, there was a refugee crisis across Europe, especially in the autumn of 2015 and 2016. A number of political leaders emerged with a very strong and polarizing discourse on the validity of various nations of Europe welcoming people who presumably lost the protection of their state of origin and were seeking asylum in Europe. And that has really provided an opportunity for me to observe what these discourses are, what some of the arguments that they employ are. Notice also that appeals to Christianity tend to abound among populists. So what do we do of that? What do we make of that? And even though that started my journey with populism, or my study or my engagement with populism started in 2016, I need to underline that this is still a relevant issue for us today. A few months ago, an article was published in the Foreign Affairs magazine, which underlined the fact that populism is still at play today. And there's this quote that to understand how populism is evolving in the era of COVID-19 is to shine a light on the problems facing the world at the moment, and the world's democracies in particular. So just a very general approach to what populism is, looking at the dictionary. The Oxford Dictionary approaches populism and defines it as political ideas and activities that are intended to get the support of ordinary people by giving them what they want or by exciting people's emotions rather than by having good ideas. Right. The statement is there. It is obviously a pejorative term. This is not, if you're a politician, you generally do not want to be known as someone who excites people's feelings rather than providing concrete ideas. So that's the first thing that we should say. Populism is generally seen as a pejorative term, as a contemptuous slur, an author noted, to bring disrepute to political movements, politicians, or civil society movements by saying they are populists. In many times, it is a way of saying that they're unpalatable, that they are not acceptable in a democracy, that they're somehow dangerous. And there's a strong connection sometimes between the idea of populist movements and dangers for democracy. But I believe that if we want to approach populism properly, we need to have maybe a more complex and more critical approach to it. In my book, the chapter you hopefully read about populism, I approach populism as a twofold phenomenon. First, populism is a situation of distrust. It's a social phenomenon, a situation of distrust. We could call that populism as experienced, the movement of populism. It is a social phenomenon. And on the other hand, populism is a narrative. And I will underline the fact that it's a narrative of redemption, which should be of interest to us as Christians. If we see a narrative of redemption promoted in the public, what is that narrative and how can we engage with it? So a situation of distrust and a narrative of redemption. I'd like to look at that for a few moments. Firstly, the situation of distrust, or as I described, populism as experienced. A communications firm named the Edelman Trust publishes every year what they call the Trust Barometer, which seeks to measure levels of trust, especially in the United States, but it's an international survey which looks at a variety of countries representative of various regions in the world, and they ask questions about levels of trust in a variety of institutions. Government, the media, the NGOs, and the businesses. And it's a very long-standing trend that levels of trust in the public, in institutions such as the government, have gone down progressively. In 2021, government and media are the least trusted institutions. The levels of trust towards the government and media are lower than the NGOs and businesses. It's around 50%. The Edelman Trust also finds that government is generally perceived as fairly unethical and grossly incompetent in what they do in their action. And government only gathers about 50% of trust, or the trust of 50% of the public. The Eurobarometer is another survey conducted by services that are attached to the European Commission and ask a variety of questions on a regular basis. And the latest survey about levels of trust in democracy and democratic institutions across Europe, and that includes the UK, of course, in 2018, underlines that government and institutions have 60% of distrust in many countries. There are a few exceptions, but generally speaking, the general trend is a trend of distrust. So we have majorities in a number of countries who express their distrust in their government. There's about 50% of trust in the European Union, so that's quite interesting. It's contrary to what many would have thought. Levels of trust in the European Union are actually higher. There is higher trust generally in the respect for human rights in our nations. But generally speaking, there are high levels of distrust in representative institutions. Thirdly, what we can observe is that distrust is systemic and existential. That's what various studies on populism, or the social circumstances in which populism arises, are showing that there's a breakdown of social relationships. People are lonelier. People have much weaker networks of relationships. A study of the OECD showed that only 10 to 15% of Europe's populations, or not Europe's populations, but populations of the OECD, only 10 to 15% say that they can count on someone in case of something dramatic happening in their life. So levels of alienation, of isolation, of atomization are very high. So breakdown of social relationship, the loss of meaning, that's what social psychologists are saying, that there's generally a loss of meaning in Western populations, and worries about the future. In several countries where citizens are surveyed about the levels of trust about the future, these levels are low. It varies from country to country, but one general trend is that the younger generations tend to be less hopeful than the older generations. So that indicates a success, in a way, of that situation of distrust among younger voters. So that's to describe the general situation of distrust, and populism is a social phenomenon as well as a political movement. A political movement based on a narrative. So this is about populism as narrated. the populist storytelling by political entrepreneurs. Their narrative is based around the concept of power and centered on a key idea in politics, which is sovereignty. Sovereignty being defined as supreme agency. So populist political entrepreneurs will tap in the desire for agency in the population. And they'll tell you a story with a number of protagonists, like any good story, which begins with the people. The people is at the center. It's the key actor, key player in that story. But there's a tension which the populists install as they try to make sense of the general situation of distrust, which I talked about earlier. The various characters of the story are the elite, the people, the populists themselves, and the nefarious others. A key feature of populist storytelling is polarization. There's a fine German word, Feindbild, which means the portrait of an enemy, which was coined to describe basically what the Nazi movements and the fascist movements in Germany and in Italy in the 1930s have developed, which is to paint the portrait of an enemy, which is never precise enough, but never too vague, just enough to polarize the population. A fixation on a category of people to hate. And the Feindbild, the portrait of the enemy, includes both the elites and other people in the population, which are described as having common interests with the elite. And both the elite and the others in the population are undermining the interests of the people. Now, another thing to underline is that populism is not a political ideology per se. It grows on political ideologies and in political parties, but per se, populism is more a mode of narrative and a general sentiment than an ideology. So according to the political ideology, populist storytellers will refer to certain concepts or will have their own typical enemies. So the more left-leaning populists will have problems with the rich, with the people who are arch-conservative, the people who are portrayed as Nazis or haters. On the other hand, right-wing populist movements will tend to point the finger more at liberals, whatever that means, or immigrants, Muslims, the refugee. So the term identifying that enemy or that other varies according to the ideology, but we do find populism both left and right. And the role of the populist is to redeem that situation of distrust, which I presented before, by giving sovereignty and agency back to the people, by simplifying the institutions, by an authoritarian rule, a majoritarian rule, so the majority decides whatever is good. When the majority has spoken, the people have spoken. So not much room for dissenting voices or minorities here. And this strong polarization between the causes that are defended by the populists and presumably what they interpret as the interests of the people and the enemies of the people. So that is a key a feature of the populist narrative. It's this aspect of polarization, also majoritarianism and authoritarianism. But one thing which we should say about this narrative, and that connects here with a couple of the comments I heard from you before starting, is that there are levels of empathy. Populist storytellers are people who understand the populist situation, who manage to tell a convincing story about it and lead people towards a solution, modes of action. And this is why populists are popular. Otherwise, they wouldn't have success. They wouldn't grow the way they've grown over the past 15 years in various countries of Europe. They manage to reflect the views and psychological situation of many in Europe. And that begs the question, why is it that these seem to be the only ones to do that? Now, I go on in the book, and we can come back to this depending on what you'd like to explore, to underline the fact that there is an irreconcilable incompatibility, if I can emphasize it that way, between the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, which are the basis upon which democracies in Europe are founded, and these various aspects of populists, of the populist narrative. The polarization, the simplistic even polarization, does not work with a liberal democratic system where there are multiple axes of cleavage, political cleavage. There is no room for political moderation, no room for the virtues of deliberation, no support for a vital opposition, and no proper respect for the rule of law itself. That's what majoritarianism and authoritarianism are against. If the majority speaks the truth, then the majority rules and not law. In liberal democracies, the law rules, not majorities. And in particular, the principle of the protection of minorities is quite central to liberal democracy. And we could analyze the reasons why populism has emerged the way it has. I think one of the main ways we can understand why we are where we are is, on the one hand, the movement of globalization. Now, globalization has been there for 5 centuries, but it has accelerated in a certain way since the 1980s and that's the other movement, with the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. And we are seeing the consequences of that. If you have questions about it, of course, I can discuss some more, but I would like to spend a few minutes discussing the place of Christianity in populist discourse. The first thing we can say about Christianity, the Christian faith, is that, as I referred to earlier, the Christian message, or Christianity itself, is a kind of trellis on which the vine of populism grows effectively. It is a heritage, a culture, a faith which various populist leaders refer to. And I spent some time looking at various political parties, both from the left and from the right, in a variety of countries, and I found interesting speeches in Colombia, for instance, or in Europe, the Dutch Socialist Party, the French insubordinate France, La France Insoumise, which is the left-wing populist party, which are all parties stemming from a left-wing standpoint and appeal to Christianity. Now, right-wing populist parties are more popular. I mean, they have more success in Europe, and they more readily connect with Christianity. Of course, the former Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Salvini, or Viktor Orban in Hungary are very good examples of political figures who refer to Christianity very regularly, and Christianity has really a place in their political ideology, but also the manipulation of symbols, because Christianity is seen there, and that's my second point, more as an identity than a message or a faith movement per se. There are two sides to it. The first one is an identity of refuge against decline, the decline of state power in globalization, the decline of traditions and certain social practices, social change, which is interpreted as social decline, and also the decline of welfare states. And that's an interesting development in the last 10 to 15 years. The discourse of political parties which stem from the right wing and usually used not to be extremely supportive of the welfare state, quite prominently refer to solidarity and the connection that Christianity brings in the European populations, to argue that the state has a responsibility to provide welfare, financial welfare, but also social welfare in the population. That's a very interesting and fairly recent development. The other side of the discourse on Christianity is that Christianity is depicted as an identity of defense against Islam, and Islam and Muslims in particular are presented as these signs of that other that Europe is not. It's a sort of a negative self-definition, which is reminiscent of Europe during the time of the Crusades, right? Europe identified itself by what it's not. It is not Muslim. It's not coming from the regions where Islam has the majority, and therefore Europe is Christian. But of course, if we return to a more biblical understanding of what Christianity or the Christian faith is, Christianity is not fundamentally a people's identity. It is a personal relationship, which creates communities, and these communities, the Bible is extremely emphatic on that point. These communities include people from all backgrounds, and that's where we're seeing an inconsistency between the Christian message, if it's approached biblically, and the recuperation or the articulation of what Christianity is in the political discourse of populist entrepreneurs, which is why I advocate for a complex approach, and that's, I believe, our role as Christians, to approach populism in a complex manner. First of all, because the polarization we hear in populist narrative can arise from anywhere. In the past 18 months, I have witnessed a change of discourse. The fine build of the portrait of the enemy has changed because simply politics has been dominated by the global pandemic, and suddenly the elites are big pharma, right? And the World Health Organization. And this is, on the one hand, a sign that populist discourse can change and adapt to what is happening, but also that there are lots of motifs of polarization that can potentially be there in society. And as Christians, we need to be aware of that there is potential for polarization, there is potential for conflict, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And that should also drive the kind of witness that we have in society. Secondly, practicing Christians in many countries, and that's why I have observed, tend to be less prone to supporting populist discourse. Generally speaking, in a number of countries we have studied in Is God a Populist, people who identify as Christians and whose approach to the Christian faith is a more biblical one will tend to have a more critical approach to populism. That does not mean that they don't resonate with the populist situation. They understand the situation of distrust. They understand the brokenness in society. They understand the relational breakdown. But the narrative which they hear from populist leaders does not necessarily convince them as much as it does other citizens. In France, and that's discussed in Is God a Populist, I have taken some time to observe on the basis of a number of social studies, the connection between adhesion to Christianity, so identifying oneself as a Christian, and support for populist parties, and also resonance with the populist situation. And what I found is that you find Christians everywhere, at every point of the spectrum, which I believe sets Christians in a particularly hopeful position in society, with an ability to understand the populist situation, for some of them to support the populist narrative, and for others to criticize it, to critique it, together on one same basis, which is the basis of the message of the gospel and the meaning of the Bible. I would like just to finish with one thought about how to understand the role of the state and what the state is, and contrast that with the general approach which is promoted by populism. This here is a classical Reformational Protestant understanding of the state's role, based on the idea that there is in society, in civil society, you find structural diversity and diversity of institutions, of social bodies and activities. You find confessional diversity. This is self-explanatory, a diversity of worldviews. And you also find cultural diversity, which is the diversity of lifestyle, political convictions, not only cultural diversity due to migration, but also stemming from the inside, a variety of lifestyles. The role of the state is to stand outside of civil society and be an institution which is there for creating common law or public law, and to generate law which is applicable for everyone, which does not take sides. The biblical understanding behind that is that we see in the book of Genesis that God created the universe in diversity, and that diversity has continued. And therefore, it is not surprising that we will find diversity in our societies, all forms of diversity. And the role of the state is to be a community which produces law for the common good, for the public. And for that, it has to be impartial, because the role of the state has to be recognized by everyone. The role of the state is to serve the public's interests, and the state has its own sphere. That, I believe, is incompatible with a vision where society is polarized between the elite and the people. That is incompatible with a vision where the state seizes more and more power and encroaches on the functions of civil society. That is incompatible with a vision where the diversity, the natural diversity of society is not recognized and is seen as a problem.